Back before my mum died in 2004, I lived with her. We were never well off, in fact, quite the opposite. After my mum got pregnant with me, my dad left and it was just the two of us from then on. I was working at the age of 12, trying to help cover food and other bills as she struggled to keep us afloat, juggling 2 jobs and working up to 18 hours a day. No joke. I was raised on a trailer park in an old battered trailer that was left to my mum after her dad had died. I knew nothing other than this trailer, and the only people I knew lived on the trailer park as well. Our park was our own little world, even hosting a makeshift convenience store. Except to go to work and school, me and Ma never really went to the city, and as such, a lot of my time was spent reading as we didn't always have electricity. Our trailer was near the entrance to the park, and the park itself, I found out recently, was built on old Native American land that was taken by the government during the US's attempts to assimilate the Native American populations. My mother never knew this, and as I say, I only recently found this out, but it could explain a lot of the activity. The activity that I am talking about was unexplained things that would happen in and around our trailer. It had happened for as long as I can remember, and in my younger years, I can recall myself believing it was normal. Things started off small from what I can remember, and I believe they may have escalated once I began to look into it. All of my memories growing up as a kid include some motif of the paranormal. I was never scared of bumps in the night. I grew up with them, and like I say, I grew up thinking this was the norm as my mum never said anything about it to me. After 13 years of hearing disembodied voices, items moving on their own and bumps, creaks and knocks, I finally found out that all this activity wasn't actually normal at all. One day during summer, I had invited one of my friends from school around to our trailer. He lived on the trailer park too, and when he came round, we were playing with toy soldiers when he told me that his trailer was haunted. Because of what I'd grown up with and the movies I'd seen, I thought a haunting was full-bodied apparitions and violent attacks. When he told me why his trailer was haunted, I was confused to hear that they matched up with the activity I had been experiencing for more than a decade. This got me interested in hauntings, and I picked up a few books from the library in town when I went in to go to school. 13-year-old me suddenly entered the realm of the undead, and I digested information on ghosts, demons, possession, and poltergeists, which I did believe is what I was dealing with. Nowadays, I think it was much worse. In the fall of that same year, I had my same friend round who I'm not gonna name at his request. We are still in contact with each other, but he's moved away. When I said that, I wanted to attempt to contact the spirit through an Ouija board. I had read about them in the volumes I had acquired and hoped I'd be able to ask the spirit to leave. Fucking dumb idea. My friend agreed, and I assembled a makeshift board on a piece of paper using some crayons. It looked shabby, but I copied it from a picture in one of the books, so at least I knew everything was in the right places, and then we used a shot glass as the planchette. Being silly little kids, we were asking stupid questions. And I mean stupid questions, like, when will I die and do ghosts poo? We were giggling like the immature little children we were. After a couple more minutes of these sorts of questions, me and my friend were really giddy when the planchette tugged us both over to the no. It tugged so hard that the paper the Ouija board was drawn on crumpled. I looked straight at my friend and started laughing. He laughed too, and I told him not to do that again. His laugh turned into a look of horror. I thought you moved it, he said nervously. I thought he was trying to get me with a double whammy and was about to say as much when the planchette shot out from under my hand and smashed against the trailer wall. As if that wasn't crazy enough, my friend's hand wasn't even touching our makeshift planchette. And I screamed and crumpled up the paper board, and I was freaking out at what had just happened and didn't know what to do next when the bulb from the light above our heads burst, spraying tiny glass particles all over us. And I was too scared to move but forced myself to as I didn't want to get in trouble for the mess. My friend left with the colour in his face drained, and after that, he very rarely came round much afterwards. The activity only worsened for me. I had recurring nightmares of being flayed alive and roasted over a spit by some unseen dark mass. It sounds cliche, but I would always be struggling to turn my head, and right at the moment when I could, the moment when I was about to gaze at this torturer, I'd wake up panting. Creepy occurrences weren't just in my mind though. Physical activity increased tenfold, with things like our trailer violently shaking in the middle of the night despite there being no winds. This would even wake my mum up, who, on more than one occasion, believed it to be an earthquake. And things that had definitely been left in the trailer, such as dinnerware, would disappear and then appear days later outside in the dirt. Things progressed like this for years to come, and during my mid-teens, I would see the shadow from my dreams whilst awake. And I would see it out of the corner of my eye, and when I looked over, it would be gone. And I doubted it at first and thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but I noticed that it would get closer. The closer it got, the louder it got too, emitting a deep, guttural gargle that would make my blood curdle. And I told my friend about this, but he told me since the Ouija board years ago, nothing extraordinary had happened to him. I was alone. This haunting became unbearable when I would wake up deep in the night to the sound of the gurgles. I would wake up to see two piercing white eyes staring at me from the end of my bed and a shadow that appeared liquid in nature. I would flick on my lamp and there would be nothing there. I put up with this until this shadowy demon was right next to me in my bed. I ended up telling my mum, who never actually admitted to experiencing the same, but her eyes and the fact that she actually believed me told me she had experienced similar. We bought sage and burnt it, and my mum prayed frequently. She even bought a cross and hung it on the wall. After this, the shadowy figure actually began falling further and further back until the activity went back to the same level as when I was a small child. I never did find out what the shadowy creature was, but even to this day, I still think I catch a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye. I was 20 years old 2 years ago when me, my mum and my dad moved into a lovely old French-style house in New Orleans. It was an expensive property, but my dad was an investment banker before retirement and I helped out as I couldn't afford a place on my own. It didn't take long for all of us to realise the place was haunted. My mother and father were both skeptics, but it's hard to ignore full-bodied apparitions which we all saw. I remember the night it all came out. We had been living there about 3 weeks and I had been seeing full-bodied apparitions. We were all sat at the dinner table and I decided to bring it up. I had done this before in previous homes and was always brushed off by my parents with the same old explanations like it being an old house. This time, they didn't protest. There was a moment of awkward silence and then my mother admitted that she too had seen apparitions. My father choked momentarily on his food. He told us too that he had seen a young black woman walking around the lower levels in the kitchen and dining room. He said he once asked whom she was, to which he got no reply, and the translucent figure just continued to potter around the kitchen before walking through a wall and disappearing. My mother had claimed to see her too, working the ovens in the kitchen, though the oven itself never physically moved or turned on. She had only ever seen this young woman, who we all believe was a slave, once. I had never seen her. And my mother had also said she saw a tall, skinny white man, dressed in formal evening attire. He looked posh by my mother's description, and she had seen him walking up the spiral staircase, lying in her and my father's bed in the master bedroom and smoking a pipe in the study. She said he seemed like an angry man, but never felt in any danger with him. Me nor my father had seen the old man, and my mother suggested she could have been overreacting, as these sightings were after the slave woman's sightings. Finally, there was the apparition I'd seen. The apparition was that of a cat, and this was the only haunting at the house that we believed was truly intelligent. The cat would run away at the sight of us and disappear into thin air. It was a white wisp of a creature that seemed to be smoky and silky. It had a white trail that followed it, and it floated like smoke. After this discussion at the dinner table, we all silently agreed to put up with the spirits. We never really spoke of them after this, especially my father, who was straddling the line between ignorance and denial. After all, the ghosts weren't bothering us, so why would we bother them? A few other things happened to us before I moved out. I just want to clarify, I didn't move out because of the activity, but because I met my now husband. Anyway, one time, my mother told me of how she was baking a cake and had begun beating the eggs in a bowl. The phone rang and she left the room. She returned to see the slave woman making the motions of whisking. My mother watched her for a good minute, she said, before the slave looked up with what my mum described as a look of pure dread before fading away in front of her. The most horrifying occurrence, and the only occurrence where any of the spirits actually interacted with each other, came one night in November. Me and my mother had been sat in one of the living rooms watching television when we both heard a heart-wrenching scream. We had no idea what it was, and we had no guests, and we ran to the bottom of the stairs near where we heard it. There, we were faced with the tall man who had his hands around the slave's neck. Despite knowing they were both dead, there was a rush of panic at the unfolding scene. The slave, terrified and gasping for air, the tall man, his face awash with pure anger. In one moment, he threw the slave down the stairs, who silently bounced and crumpled and then dispersed like smoke before landing at our feet. Me and my mother gazed up the stairs, shocked, but the tall man had gone. I tried looking into the history of the house, but there had been no recorded murders there. Nevertheless, me and my mother believed that the tall man murdered the slave woman. I moved out 2 years after moving in, and my mum and dad still live there to this day. They still tell me that they experience and see the ghosts, and I have more stories of my own to tell if anyone is interested. I'd be happy to tell. I grew up in Japan and lived there until I was 7. We relocated to Great Britain, and if I'm honest, I'm so glad we did. I want to share with you an experience that happened to me about a fortnight before we moved away. As a disclaimer, I'd always been scared of the dark and always thought our house was haunted. We lived in an old, traditional Sukiya-zukuri style home in rural Japan. Growing up, I'd always experienced odd things as a child, but only usually bumps in the night. This night was different. I was trying to sleep, but had trouble doing so like most nights when I glanced over at my bedroom door. We had traditional shoji doors, and I remember seeing a shadow form out of the ground. Its silhouette appeared to be wearing tattered rags that hung around its withered, scrawny body. Suddenly, my door slid open. I pulled my covers up to my eyes and heard scraping across my wooden flooring. I sat still for what felt like years until I finally deemed it safe to lower my covers. Bad idea. This withered witch-looking woman was stood at the end of my bed, pointing at me, her gaping rotten mouth a dark tunnel that consumed me. She was looking at me, though she had no eyes, just two bloody holes where eyes should have been. She began making this croaking noise and leaning further over my bed. I could smell the rot on her, and honestly, I thought I was going to die. I clenched my eyes shut and probably, out of pure exhaustion, I fell to sleep. I awoke the next day to find nothing amiss. There was no one in my room and my door was shut, but when I went into my bathroom and looked in the mirror, I had a large scratch on my stomach that had gone black, as if it was old and infected. Thankfully, this scratch healed like a normal wound, but I have no idea how I could have gotten it other than the woman. This doesn't sound like the scariest story ever, but for a 7-year-old kid, it was truly terrifying and it has scarred me to this day. I never told my mum or dad about this, but I was never sorry to see the back of that house. It's not every day you're physically harmed by the things that go bump in the night. Hey guys, Brothers Jackson here. This is 6 true scary Christmas stories, and I hope you enjoy. I was 11 years old one late December night back in the early 70s. Me, my mum and my dad lived in a large house situated on an even larger plot of open land somewhere in rural Massachusetts. Just to give you a rough idea of the layout, it was basically a few acres of open territory bar a few thick trees to the right of the property about 200 yards away if you were looking at it. On the night that I am referring to, my dad had taken the 2 or 3 mile walk into the local town to have a few drinks at the bar. Being late winter, it had been snowing heavily and so he was expected to be gone for a fair few hours given the weather. I was sat in our living room watching cartoons on TV and my mum was in one of the spare rooms preparing some homemade Christmas decorations and probably wrapping some presents. It was late, well, late considering my age, when I heard a light scraping on our front door. I looked up and gazed cautiously. I shouted for my mum but received no response. The scratching seemed to intensify. I shouted my mum again but she didn't hear me. I looked at the door and knew I shouldn't answer it, but I also knew that I could just about see out of the peephole if I stood on my tippy toes. I walked over to the door, trying to be quiet. I reached the door. The scratching from the other side continued. I was separated from this unknown thing by a piece of wood a few inches thick. My heart raced, but I thought that it was probably just an animal, but my overactive imagination conjured up images of the slasher films I'd seen my parents watch. I craned my neck and pushed myself up on my toes. I couldn't see anything. The wreath on our door was obscuring the line of sight of the peephole. I stood still, trying to look when I realised the scratching had stopped. I held my breath and clamped my hand to my mouth. I didn't move for about a minute, but it felt like an hour. I was scared that whoever, or whatever, had been scratching was alerted to my presence. I calmed down after the brief moment of silence and slowly dropped back onto my heels. I turned back around quickly and caught sight of what I thought was a pale white face staring at me through the window on the other side of the living room. It rapidly moved away and with a burst of adrenaline I rushed over to investigate. I pressed my face up against the window and could see nothing in the fields of darkness. I stepped back and reasoned it must have been the reflection of our light. I decided I'd go and tell my mum just to be safe and began walking up the stairs. Our stairs were immediately after the door, in the sense that if you entered our home, you could look right up the stairs. I had climbed about 2 stairs when the scratching started again. I paused in my tracks. "Mum!" I loudly whispered. I suddenly jumped as the door banged and then the handle began rattling. We usually left our front door unlocked, but thank the gods that, for some unknown reason that night, my dad had locked it. I began crying as the door jiggled violently. It was shaking so energetically, I thought it was going to splinter. I sat on one of the stairs and was bawling my eyes out when I heard my mum's footsteps coming towards the top of the stairs, and her voice shouting, "What on earth is that racket?" She was about to shout something else but stopped mid-word at the unravelling scene. She hurried down the stairs and the rattling ceased. She didn't hesitate to swing open the door, brandishing the revolver she kept on her hip under her dress, screaming like a maniac. My mum was a badass bitch. But no one was there. Not a soul in sight. We were surrounded by vast empty fields, yet this person or thing had managed to disappear in a matter of seconds. We discovered something even stranger that night, though. My father returned about an hour later and my mum filled him in. We didn't call the police and Mum and Dad locked up all the doors and went to comb the area. They told me years later, I had originally been told they scared the guy off, that they found 2 sets of footprints in the snow that night. My dad's walking down the trail to town and returning, and a second set, roughly size 14. They walked away from the tree line, the only place this person could have gotten cover, and they walked away from the trail, so they didn't even head into town. Mum and Dad followed the footprints until they abruptly stopped, about a quarter of a mile away, in the middle of an empty field. No sign of any vehicle. No trace of any life. This is a story about how I almost killed a man, and how Christmas was almost ruined for my family, all on the same night. It starts off like any other Christmas-themed story. It was the night before Christmas, and my 2 beautiful kids were fast asleep as me and my wife had spent all Christmas Eve tiring them out so they'd sleep like angels, and my wife herself had retired to bed as I sat in the living room setting up some of the trickier toys to assemble. It was about 2 o'clock when I had finally finished the Christmas Day setup and I went to bed, feeling like a proper dad on Christmas Eve. I had a wee and brushed my teeth before climbing into bed next to my sleeping wife when I heard a succession of thuds from downstairs. To be honest, I thought little of it as we lived in a terraced house and the walls were so thin you could hear the neighbours open a pack of crisps. I lay in bed trying to drift off when I heard a louder thump from downstairs. This time, I was almost certain it was my living room and not next door. I slowly slithered out from under my covers and rolled onto the floor, pressing my ear against the carpet. I could hear quiet little noises from the living room. It could have been footsteps. It could have been talking. I strained my ears but just couldn't quite catch it. I reached my arm out in front of me and grabbed a broken snooker cue I kept hidden under the bed in case anything like this happened. I gripped it in one hand and cautiously set off towards the door. Our door was notoriously creaky, so I'm honestly not exaggerating when I say it took me over 5 minutes to open it enough to squeeze through. However, with the adrenaline flooding my body, it felt like no time at all. All I wanted to do was get to the bottom of this situation. Our house was originally built in the 1940s and, as such, was quite old. Because of this, many of the old floorboards creaked and moaned when stood on. This, obviously, was an issue as I didn't want to alert the intruder to my whereabouts. Thankfully, I knew all the creaky planks and somehow managed to cross the landing in the dark without making a noise. I was now stood at the top of the stairs and could hear one set of footsteps walking about my house. I wasn't sure if someone else was there as I heard a man with a whiskey-washed voice mumbling. I never heard anyone reply and assumed the guy was alone and possibly drunk. I heard his footsteps fade out towards the kitchen and slowly snuck downstairs, the broken snooker cue held like a baseball bat in my hands. I got to the bottom of the stairs and walked slowly through the living room, avoiding the toys I'd been setting up less than an hour before, and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. This bastard was eating the mince pie my kids had left out for Santa. I felt a hot rage overcome me as I snuck up behind him and smashed the cue across the back of his unsuspecting head. It connected with a satisfying crack and he hit the ground with a sickening thud. A pool of blood puddled around his head as he lay twitching on our kitchen floor. I heard a loud whisper from the living room. "What the fuck are you doing?" I froze, realising there was a second intruder. I crept to the kitchen wall and poked my head around the corner slightly. There was the backside of a second intruder who was stuffing a sack full of presents from under the tree. I thought the first intruder was cheeky, but this little shit was dressed in a full Santa costume. If I'm honest, I felt guilty about the state I'd left the last intruder in. I was angry and scared and didn't really want to kill these guys. So this time, I planned to aim for the guy's arms or legs. However, before I had the chance, the guy pulled his head up and turned around to look at me. I don't know which of us was more shocked. This phony Santa robbing my kids' presents or a dad wearing nothing but his underwear. The guy launched himself at me, toppling us both over and sending my cue flying across the room. He punched me twice in my face, breaking my nose and fracturing a cheek. He knew I was incapacitated but not unconscious because he grinned at me as he set our tree on fire and left, with some of the presents, through the kitchen. I honestly can't tell you why he did that. I can't tell you why he left his accomplice to die in the kitchen. I can't even tell you why, when I pushed myself up, I didn't try to control the flames. I just ran and woke my family up and we escaped. The whole situation was a blur and with all the adrenaline, I could barely recount the events to the police. The emergency services were called and the fire obliterated the living room and all the presents that were left, but crucially, it didn't spread and was contained. The guy who I hit with the cue was alive but had a broken skull. It was mid-March when he came around and he was quick to grass up the other thief. He tried to press charges against me for assault but it failed as I had been attacked too and we argued it was self-defense on my part, despite me attacking first. After all, they did break into my house and set it alight. And he was sentenced to 1 year for breaking and entering. His friend, however, was sent down for 9 years, mainly for arson. Our entire Christmas would have been ruined that year if it wasn't for the charity of our neighbours. We stayed at and broke bread with next door and other neighbours donated money and even a few gifts to our children. We had a run-in with the very worst of society that night, but in the end, we were saved by the very best of society. It was mid-December in 2004 when I found myself in a department store that I'm not going to name, shopping for some last-minute Christmas gifts. I had my son with me who was 12 years old at the time, as his school was cancelled due to bad snow we had had the previous day, and with my wife in work, we decided to go shopping for her gifts. Now, this department store was vast. It had something like 6 or 7 floors, including a fine art hall where you could buy legitimate Hockneys and Darleys. There was a massive food court which had a load of fast food chains built in, as well as its own luxury deli counter and bakery. It had its own pet store on the top floor and had a whole floor dedicated to toys and games. Obviously, my son was eager to go to the toys, and being 12, I let him go on his own, but made him promise not to leave the toy department so I'd know where to look. The place was crammed with people, with it being so close to Christmas. There were groups of pensioners that probably came by coach, slick-looking business types in suits probably rushing on their dinner break, entire families for a day out, and a plethora of staff. It had a very festive atmosphere, and I found a very nice, expensive bag for my wife. I paid and battled through the crowds and headed towards the escalators. I headed up them and reached the toy department. There, I set about looking for him. I wouldn't say by any means that I was a bad parent, but I must admit, I felt as though I'd underestimated quite how busy it was, and I struggled to locate my son in the mobs of Christmas shoppers. After all, this was the toy department, and I had barely any space to even breathe. Being 6'5", my head was above most others, and I scanned the shop floor, looking for my son. All of a sudden, I caught sight of his coat. He was walking away from me, holding hands with a guy dressed as Santa. He hadn't noticed me. I wasn't too unnerved, as we were in a department store in mid-December, so a Santa Claus is not that abnormal to see. I assumed he had perhaps found my boy and was trying to help him locate me. However, I did push through the crowd in an attempt to rush to him to save the Santa any trouble. As I got out from the middle of a mob of people, I noticed they were heading to the escalators. Me telling my son not to leave the toy department came flooding back, and I reasoned he would have told staff I was meeting him here. That's when I saw it. As they got to the top of the escalators, I noticed my son grab onto a railing before being viciously pulled back by St. Nick. My son's face was red and I saw tears running down his cheeks. I began running through the crowds, but they were too thick. I just began shouting at the top of my lungs that my son was being kidnapped. Bystanders were confused but opened up a path for me. The escalators to each floor were rather big in the store, so as I reached the top, they had only just reached the bottom. "Hey!" I shouted angrily. My son looked up. "Dad!" he cried with relief. This shoddy Santa didn't even look up, but he realised the jig was up. He let go of my son's hand and began hurriedly pushing through the crowd, even knocking one woman over. I descended the escalators and got to my son, who was crying heavily. We embraced in the middle of the aisle, dozens of people watching us, and I apologised to him. We were taken by a member of staff to the manager's office. The manager was nice and offered us food and drink and compensation. The manager informed us that this Santa did not work for them, as they only had 2 Santas who rotated shifts in the grotto set up on the ground floor. This means that this St. Nick was just a random creep who would have done God only knows what to my son. I declined to take any compensation, as it was not the store's fault either. They never caught the guy, but CCTV shows him following my son for 10 minutes before stealing a Hot Wheels car from a packet and offering it to my son as bait. Despite refusing compensation, we were sent a Christmas hamper and 5 $100 gift cards for the store. The store manager personally called us up a few times to check in on us and even cooperated fully with the police to try and catch this guy. It took me a while to let my son have the freedom he deserved. I was pretty paranoid about it all for a while, and this remains one of the scariest things that has ever happened to me or my family. It was Christmas Eve in 2009 when me and my mum were walking home from my aunt's house. It was cold and dark and our house was a few streets over. We lived in Chelsea in London and it hadn't snowed but was particularly icy. As we walked home, there was a bin bag down an alleyway at the end of a terrace of houses. At first, I thought nothing of it. I mean, would you? We just kept walking by when I noticed it move. I tugged my mum's arm and stopped. She asked what I was doing and I held a finger to my lips in a shushing motion. She looked at the bag I was looking at. And again, it moved. My mum tried hurrying me along, telling me it was just the wind, but before we left, I could hear a soft whimpering emanating from the bag. My mum went over to have a look and we were both shocked to uncover a dog. It was a Heinz 57, but still, it looked beautiful. However, the neglect was clear as its ribs were clearly defined as its golden skin clung to its body. Its eyes were bloodshot and its claws were mangled and uncut. It clearly had fleas as the fur near its buttocks had been chewed away, revealing sore-looking skin. My mum didn't hesitate to take off her £1,000 coat to wrap this little dog up. It yelped in pain but was soon fast asleep, cradled in her arms, on the way home. Being Christmas, all the shelters and even the emergency vets nearby were closed, so we kept this dog safe in our home. We bathed it, gave it fresh food and water, and set up a small bed next to the radiator for it to snuggle up to and sleep. Which is what it did for the majority of Christmas Day and Boxing Day. The day after, me, my mum and my dad went to the emergency vets to get the dog checked out. They trimmed his claws and gave us some treatment for the fleas. They inspected his eyes and told us that they should heal as he is fed more regularly and that his skin wasn't infected from him biting his own fur off. He was then taken to a shelter and after it was discovered that he had no registered owner, he was offered to us. I begged mum and dad for him and my mum even said she wanted him, so dad caved and just like that, we had a dog. Fast forward 6 or 7 months now and it's the height of summer. Our dog, which we called Theodes, is now a healthy young friend and I walked him around the block regularly. So this one day, I'm walking with the dog near my aunt's house. It's warm and I have the dog lead in one hand and an ice pop in the other hand. We were walking down the pavement about to make our way back towards home when we walked past an average looking townhouse with an old man, probably 60 or 70, working on the garden in the front. As we walked past, my dog suddenly began growling and barking at this guy. Since we'd had him, he had never barked once and very, very rarely growled, so needless to say, I was a little bit unnerved, as well as being massively embarrassed. I looked at this poor old man who laughed nervously and I apologised. He never said anything in reply, but he watched us walk all the way up the street and I got home flustered at what had happened. I sat on our settee thinking about it and I realised just how weird Theodes' behaviour was. Something wasn't right and being a curious little girl, I decided I'd investigate. The next day, I went back to the old man's house but without my dog. His front garden was pristine, nothing untoward and nothing sinister. I walked around the back of his row of terraces and peeked into his back garden. The back garden was a mess. It was the complete opposite of his front garden and next to my peeking head was a shed. The door was slightly ajar. I attempted to readjust myself and was basically over his fence when I got a view into the small gap. I couldn't make out much but I saw a bucket filled to the brim with what appeared to be tattered dog collars. I gasped, jumped down from his fence and ran home. I pondered what had happened with him and my dog and the bucket of collars. I didn't tell my mum or dad, but plucked up the courage to report him anonymously to the RSPCA, the main UK animal welfare charity. A couple of days later, I overheard my mother talking on the phone about a neighbour I'll refer to as Fred. He had recently been fined by the police and was blacklisted from owning dogs for 5 years. I later found out the RSPCA had investigated my tip-off and discovered that he had had over 10 dogs in less than a year, and many of them were unaccounted for. Further investigations, which involved the police, found dog bodies buried in his garden in various stages of decomposition. From what I understand, he never intentionally hurt them, but given his age, he was struggling to care for them properly, and they were probably dying of neglect. I can't be sure about Theodes, but something about the way he was with Fred tells me that Fred may have had something to do with him ending up in a bin bag that night in December. Though I try not to let it bother me too much, as me and Theodes are inseparable friends and I love him dearly. When me and my partner moved into our first property, we inherited an old artificial Christmas tree off my grandma, who had passed earlier that year. The artificial tree was from the 1940s, believe it or not, and had been passed down as a sort of festive heirloom. By today's standards, it was far from grand. It was about 3 feet tall and looked like a bit of green tinsel wrapped around a thin stick. Anyway, that's by the by, because we couldn't really afford another tree, so this little thing had to do. We tried to make it look a bit more attractive by placing it on a corner table. The tree was too small to put presents under, so we opted to put them under the table. Odd things began to happen early on from there. I'd wake up to my husband Josh shouting me. He'd be asking why I moved the tree when I hadn't, so I'd head downstairs to see the table with the tree on moved, either to the centre of the room or in front of our front door. At first, I thought he was pranking me, but it soon escalated to arguments between the two of us about who had moved it. It wasn't long until we realised that the movement may be more paranormal in nature. Loud bangs from downstairs would wake both of us. On the first 2 occasions, Josh would rush downstairs with a hammer assuming somebody had broke in, but there was no signs of anything being moved or any doors or windows being open or broken. The third time, when we both woke up, Josh rushed downstairs to see our ancient festive tree spinning about on the floor, entirely of its own accord. I was stood at the top of the stairs and saw this with my own 2 eyes, and Josh claimed that when he went close to it and touched it, something growled at him. He described the growl as demonic. I didn't hear it, but I saw Josh lung backwards and scream like a baby. Josh wasn't the only one to suffer. I would be home alone or wake up in the middle of the night to hear a baby crying right outside the bedroom door. No matter where I was in the house, it emanated from there. I'd wake Josh, who would claim he couldn't hear it, and as he would fully wake up, the crying would fade out. Me and Josh had no children. We decided enough was enough and put the artificial tree in our garage, assuming that was what was causing all the activity, but that didn't stop it. In fact, it made it worse. Banging would intensify to the point neighbours would bring it up in conversations. Oft times, my partner would go out onto the drive to find our garage door wide open. Somehow, we just began to put up with it. It was like wearing wet socks or working when you have a cold. We just ignored it as best we could and got on with our lives. That was until I was physically attacked. I was laying in bed, fast asleep, my partner next to me, when suddenly I was jolted awake by the feeling of two cold, callous hands around my ankles. Before I had time to react, I was yanked off the end of the bed, hitting my head hard on our floor. I dug my palms into the floor, trying to cause friction, when I was again yanked by this unseen force and was thrown into our bedroom wall. I hit it so hard that pictures hanging on the wall fell off and hit the floor. I cried out Josh's name, but he had already woke up to the noise and had turned the lights on. There was nothing there. We had had enough, and Josh contacted the local priest, who, regrettably, refused to help as we never attended church. I managed to find a white witch on Craigslist, and she was not what you'd think. She was about 80 years old and had a thick Eastern European accent. She told us that a demonic entity had latched itself to an item and identified it as the Christmas tree. This all seemed a bit far-fetched for me and Josh, and honestly, we both didn't buy into it, but at the end of the day, we had nothing to lose. I suggested destroying or burning the tree, but the witch claimed that would worsen the activity. It would anger the entity and it could possibly latch to another object. Instead, she left and returned a few days later with a wooden box to fit the tree in. This box appeared handmade, and the underside of the lid had about 12 carvings of symbols that I had no idea what were. We put the tree in the box and stored it in the garage, and the witch left. She never asked for a cent, not even to cover travel costs or the cost for the box. We thanked her and she just smiled. Crazily, the box did work and the activity simmered down to nothing. This self-proclaimed witch off the internet had saved us, and it worked. Though the activity has stopped and we have even moved house since, I still get an uneasy feeling when erecting our new artificial tree. It hasn't ruined Christmas, not by a long way. It's more just a feeling of grim remembrance, but we do, still, have that old artificial tree in the hexed box, stored in some dusty corner of our attic. I used to, on a seasonal basis, work as a Santa Claus at a shopping mall about 3 miles from my home in Texas. I'm about to tell you the reason why I don't, and never will, be a Santa again. So, it's peak holiday time and the mall is fucking rammed with people on a daily basis. I'm sat in the middle of the main plaza, a whole setup of North Pole decor and fake Lapland signs. There's a queue of people stretching back miles, and I'm tired, hot, and bothered. So about 3 hours into my shift, this woman comes over with her kid, and there's basically a whole experience when visiting Santa at this mall. After you meet me, dressed as good old St. Nick, the children then have a tour of the grotto, receive a free gift, and then have a picture taken. So this mum just dumps her kid on me, mutters, "I'll be back in a minute, yeah?" in a proper basic voice, and disappears off, leaving me with her kid. I ask the kid his name and he tells me, and I take on Santa's persona, asking the generic questions like what he wants for Christmas. All of a sudden, this booming voice pierces the noise of the mall as a gritty man shouts, "Oi, what the fuck are you doing with my kid, you pedo?" I look up, thinking it's nothing to do with me, when I see this butch, bald man running towards me. He had a cobweb tattooed on his face and sleeves up his arms. I heard the kid sat on my lap say, confused, "Dad?" Then, wham! The next thing I know, I wake up in hospital with a bandage around my head and my face feeling like it's about to burst. Turns out, this guy had attacked me, knocked me out, and broke my nose and knocked out a few teeth. I later found out that the guy was the father of the kid sat on my lap, but that he was also, quote unquote, a psycho ex of the kid's mum and was banned from seeing them, or from being within a certain distance of them. He was a heavy drug taker who was in and out of prison, and he had been stalking her for months. She had no idea he was at the mall and had no idea I'd been attacked by him at first. Just to confirm, I'm not a paedophile and I was doing nothing dirty or illegal with this kid, and the police proved that. They also proved this ex-boyfriend was coked up too, and that's probably why he attacked me. He went back to prison, but only for something ridiculous like 40 days. I stay well clear from being a seasonal Santa, and I'm ashamed to admit, I'm really cautious around children. I was 12 when this happened to me, one late Christmas Eve, back in the early 2000s. By this age, I knew that Santa wasn't real. Spoiler. And based on that logic, one would assume that his evil brother, Krampus, who was the Antichrist of Santa, does not exist either. I'm sorry to tell you that you're wrong. How do I know this? Well, I've seen it. Let me take you back to that Christmas Eve when I was 12, and I'll explain to you what happened. We lived in a large suburban house in Adelaide in Australia. December is our summertime, so this particular night was sticky and warm. I was excited for Christmas Day and was struggling to nod off. I was in that state where you are half asleep and half awake, where your body is shutting down yet external stimuli is still affecting you. That's when I heard the sound of cloven hoofs on the roof. My eyes shot open and I concentrated my listening upwards. I knew it couldn't be Santa. He wasn't real. The hoofs continued across our roof, but it sounded off. It sounded like every second step was softer. Like whatever was on the roof was injured or limping. Then I heard it. A thud from downstairs, followed by the sound of chains? I was pretty confused at this point and pulled my covers up to my neck. I could hear the cloven foot making its way slowly up the stairs, the sound of heavy iron chains rattling on each step like death himself was upon my door. I was now wide awake, and at this point it's difficult to describe my feelings. I just want to say that this was a time before the internet was commonplace in our family, and I'd never heard of Krampus. All the signs were pointing to it being St. Nick in my head, but I had grown out of that a couple of years ago. So, at the time, I was sat in bed wondering who, or what on earth, could be in my house, right outside my room. I had a feeling I'd find out soon as my doorknob slowly twisted and clicked as the door began to open. I now had the covers over my entire body and my clammy hands were clenching them tight. I heard an animalistic breath and the same rhythm of hoof, soft step, making its way across my bedroom, and the rattling of those deathly chains. It stopped abruptly, as did the breathing. I never moved, never opened my eyes, and never pulled the covers down, but I knew this thing was stood right at the end of my bed, watching me. I dared not move, but during the heat of an Australian summer, I felt close to passing out. Nothing had happened for what felt like a lifetime, so I slowly and cautiously began pulling the covers down. I wish I hadn't. As the cover drifted down under my eyes, I opened them and my eyes fixed directly to the end of my bed. There I saw this beast. As black as the night, hunched over. It had two curly goat-like horns protruding from the crown of its head, thick, greasy black fur covering the entirety of its hunched body, apart from its face that was disgustingly and unnervingly human in nature. It had piercing red eyes and one cloven hoof, and one human-like foot still covered in the fur. It had a small and curly pig-like tail that protruded from its buttocks, and thick rusty iron chains binding its limbs together in a way that I imagine would make it painful for this creature to walk. But it did. Around my bed and next to my scared head, its chains playing their haunting melody. The beast stared right into my eyes, into my soul. It breathed. I whimpered and then it slowly drifted back, out of my room, without breaking eye contact with me. I heard the chains drop down each and every stair in my house with agonizing slowness. I never moved an inch, even when I heard the hoof on my roof. Christmas Day was ruined for me that year. I couldn't concentrate on anything and I became slightly introverted regarding the events. Even now, I've only told 2 people since then and I'm not really sure of what I actually saw. Could it have been sleep paralysis? I don't know because I wasn't fully asleep, and for this creature to match the traditional image of Krampus without me ever have knowing about it is crazy. I've seen the movie Krampus since then and it didn't look like that as much as it did the traditional Krampus. And I think that's even scarier. I'm in college now, but this happened to me and a small group of my friends about 4 years ago when we were 16. We all lived in a small town in rural Arkansas which had a massive high school that served us and other surrounding towns. It was late December this one year and we had broke up for Christmas. During the few days after Christmas, the week where you don't know what to do and everything is really slow during the build up to New Year, me and 3 of my friends, John, Lee and Shane, all decided to break into our school to play with a Ouija board. There had been stories floating around for as long as I could remember about our school being haunted and all the misfortunes and drama that had occurred there. We believed none of it and decided we would check it out for ourselves. Breaking in was pretty easy and we found ourselves in the assembly theatre. The seats in the theatre were designed so they could be dragged back and stacked against a wall, each row above the other. The staff had done this for Christmas break, so the assembly room was just a stage and an empty patch of floor. John went into the corridor and returned with a small table. Me and Shane salvaged some chairs for us to use and I pulled 2 candles out of my bag. I'd read that they are perfect for helping with spirit communication. Lee supplied the board, an old heavy wooden one that his parents had used when they were kids. Looking back, this was probably a bad call and we should have just bought a new one. He placed it on the table and then fished the planchette out of his bag. We all made a pact not to influence the board falsely in any way, and to this end, I still trust all of my friends. We were jokers, but we were an honest bunch. We each put our hands on the planchette and all looked at each other, wondering who was ballsy enough to speak out first. It was Shane. He asked the simple question, "Is anyone here with us?" Nothing happened. Not even a shake. He repeated the question and we all waited a moment. Again, Nothing. We were all already skeptical from the start, but we were beginning to think all the stories had been just stories. I was the one who decided to ask the next question, and I asked if anyone had died on the land on which the school was built. Again, we all waited a moment, and again, nothing happened. We decided to take our hands off of the planchette and sat talking for a while. We figured we might have a walk around and see if anything creepy would happen to us. We had barely even glanced at the planchette and Ouija board, nor had we called out to any potential spirits when, seemingly out of nothing, the 2 candles blew out. All 4 of us agree there was no breeze strong enough to cause that. We all sort of screamed. It sounds pathetic, but it was more of the shock of it all. And it was pretty much totally dark for us all, as our eyes hadn't had time to adjust when I heard a long, deep exhale from the doorway. None of my friends were stood there. I was terrified, as that was the only way out. We all stood, and Lee threw the board and planchette into his bag. I went to blindly pick up the candles. I got one, but the other seemed to slide off the table and it smashed. It could have been knocked, but Lee, Shane or John didn't seem to be near the table. We all ran out of the assembly hall, chills running down our spines. There were a lot of hurried footsteps making their way out of the school, but me, and also afterwards Lee, recalled hearing footsteps following behind us. We both admitted we were too scared to look. So that is the story of the first and last time I've used a Ouija board, and although nothing bad actually happened, I've decided that these unknown forces just aren't worth messing with. I live in a small hamlet in Shropshire in the UK. It was built around an old church that dated back to the 11th century and was a local and historical landmark. Unfortunately, the council didn't give a shit about it, and for as long as I've known, it has been abandoned and left to ruin. When I was growing up, the damage was so severe that the main hall had no ceiling and brickwork was falling to pieces. Vandals had salvaged lead and other metals, and the wooden doors had rotted off their hinges. This church still dominated our little hamlet, sitting atop a large hill that looked over the settlement of no more than 24 buildings. The hill itself was quite flat at the top and hosted a small graveyard. Nobody had been buried there since the 1700s, as there were no plots and most burials were now at a larger cemetery in the city. As such, the graves were much like the church itself, falling apart and in disrepair. Some of the oldest ones were so worn by the weather that names and dates could no longer be made out on them. As you can imagine, growing up in such a small place was boring, and there was only one other person my age who lived there. Kathy was my best friend and we did everything together. One time when we were about 14, our boredom reached a climax. We were old enough to want a bit more from our lives, yet too young to drive or go to the nearest city alone. It was a half-term break and our parents basically let us stay out till whenever, as we couldn't get in much trouble nor would much happen to us in a small little place where everyone knew everyone. We hatched a plan to go and use a Ouija board I had nicked out of my parents' wardrobe and contact the spirits buried at the church. It was 1 AM and a warm spring night when we made the short hike up the hill to the old church, just me and Kathy. This night, a large full moon dominated the sky. It appeared almost light and we were without fear as we crept through the old stone archway and into the open hall. We sat on the floor in the middle of the aisle with nothing but an old Hasbro Ouija board, 2 torches, and each other. We had never read the rules and instantly began asking when we would die and how, and were inviting spirits to possess each other. Obviously, this was a big mistake, and after laughing and joking, I began to notice Kathy was becoming distant. She was staring into space, hardly talking and muttering one-word answers at best when I questioned her. It may have been the moonlight, but she even appeared to be quite pale in the face. She was deflecting or ignoring my questions now. And about 5 minutes after, I noticed her behaviour change. Her nose began bleeding. I had known Kathy for over a decade and had never known her to suffer from nosebleeds. She seemed unfazed, and I took my hands off the planchette to see if she was okay. As soon as I did, she shrieked at me, telling me to put my fucking hands back on the planchette. I was scared and did as I was told. We sat there awkwardly as Kathy deliberately pulled the planchette from yes to no repeatedly, all the while blood pooling on her lap. After another 10 or so minutes of this, I decided I needed to pluck up the courage to get us out of here. I had a feeling I was dealing with something otherworldly, something paranormal, and that Kathy wasn't actually Kathy. I had to save my best friend. I let go of the planchette once again. She began shrieking at me and, I shit you not, began telling me to place my hands back on it, in a voice that sounded like an 80-year-old man. I meekly murmured, no, and Kathy flung her head back and made a gurgling sound before spitting on my shirt. Phlegm and blood mixed on it. I grabbed one of her wrists and pulled it off the planchette, as I walked around the board to her side. Suddenly, Kathy slapped me across my face with the back of her hand so hard I went flying backwards onto the Ouija board. Now, if you thought the events so far were unbelievable, bear with me for the next part. I don't know if I actually saw this, or if it was shock from the slap, my imagination, or just a bird or something, but this is an account of the events that happened to me that night, and I can only recall them as I remember them. Now, as I flung back, my head twisted, and as I was falling, I remember seeing what appeared to be a woman in a tattered black gown which covered her face. It wasn't a shadow. I could make out finer details than just the darkness, and it appeared to have an arm outstretched, though I couldn't see if it was pointing or beckoning. I hit the stone floor and lay there still for a moment. I remember pushing myself up, the old church spinning in my head. I remember violently grabbing Kathy and hauling her out of the church, Kathy screaming, trying to loosen herself from my grip. I remember how, as we left the graveyard and descended the hill, she seemed to calm and couldn't remember a thing. I remember everything, and so do my sleepless nights. We left the Ouija board and our torches up there that night, and since, I refused to even go near the place. Kathy doesn't remember a thing after the first few questions and never believed she hit me so hard that it cut my cheek. Ouija boards are not something I recommend you mess around with, but if you decide to, be prepared for the consequences. I had always had a close relationship with my grandma, and to tell you the truth, she was a cool woman. She was into witchcraft, the occult, and spiritualism. She had an impeccable record of safety up until her death a few years ago, aged 96, but she did slip up once, and it was my fault. I don't blame myself anymore. Being so close with her, I myself also had an interest in the occult and witchcraft, and for as long as I can remember, I had always wanted to use a Ouija board. My grandma was strictly against them, and I think my fascination with them stems from that and the almost mythical status they hold amongst Wiccans, occultists, and paranormal researchers. The night this happened, I was in my early 20s and I had been round at my grandma's to watch a movie, eat a pizza, and have a few glasses of wine. Despite my long interest in wanting to use a Ouija board, I have never acted upon it, as I had a lot of respect for my grandma and her warnings. The movie had finished and we were sat talking. My grandma was telling me about the new spell she had added to her grimoire and showing me some new ingredients she had bought. The topic shifted on to Ouija boards. It didn't tend to usually. I never really pushed it, as she had always been pretty stern regarding it, yet it somehow crept itself into the night's conversation. I never asked to use the Ouija board, but at one point my grandma sighed and said something along the lines of, "Lily, I'm getting old now. I'm experienced, and I'll be damned if I go out afraid of something to do with the subjects that have given me and my life so much meaning." With this, she stood up, and I honestly believed she was about to break the news that she had cancer or Alzheimer's. However, she shuffled over to the cupboard that was nestled next to her kitchen and pulled out an old, damaged box covered in dust. She put it on the table, and my heart fluttered as I saw it was an old Ouija board. Very old. I looked up at my grandma, still saying nothing. She smiled slightly. "There's no one else I'd rather try it with," she said. She lit candles around the whole house, turned off the lights and closed all the doors. She debriefed me on all the key rules which I'd already read about online. Don't let go of the planchette, remember to say goodbye, don't ask when or how you will die, etc. I was about to place my hand on the planchette when my grandma stopped me and asked if I was sure I wanted to do this. I did think about it for a moment and decided that yes, I did. My grandma told me that when she was young and foolish, her and one of her friends used this exact Ouija board to contact spirits, and it, quote-unquote, went dangerously wrong. She never did fully explain what happened, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We both placed our hands on the planchette, and it instantly began circling. My grandma told me to stay strong, as this meant the spirit is trying to show us it's in charge. She said this with control, but I could see her flinching slightly. I was shaking, yet even so, the planchette was moving in almost perfect ovals. Out of nowhere, the planchette shot to each corner of the board, dragging us like ragdolls with it. I went to let go, but my grandma shouted, "No!" Then, the planchette slid from under both of our hands and hit the floor as though it weighed a ton. It hit and stuck. My grandma passed out and fell forward, cracking her head off the table, and I felt super dizzy. I put my grandma in the recovery position and went to call an ambulance. For some reason, the phone line was dead. I was trying to use the phone whilst watching my grandma, and because I was stressed, I began pacing and turned around to face the kitchen door. It was open. The lighting of the candles made the situation more daunting as I looked into the darkness of the kitchen. My mind was overacting, and I saw shadows moving from within. Suddenly, the kitchen door slowly began moving and closing. I dropped the phone and stood in petrified fear. Before I knew it, my grandma clasped my shoulder. "Quick, come help me." She had the Ouija board and planchette in her hands. She took us out to the garden and she burned it there and then. She told me similar had happened to her the last time she used it, and after the Ouija board had burnt out, We turned to head back in. We both saw it. A middle-aged woman, pale as the moon, deep sunken eyes and an evil look on her face. The description doesn't do it justice. It really doesn't. It was more terrifying than a horned demon, than a monster. The look on this woman's face was almost condescending, as if to say, "This plane is mine now." We burnt sage and my grandma had a long-time friend, Father Ray, come and bless the house. Since my grandma's death, the house has been sold, but in the years I visited after this incident, me and my grandma both sensed the presence was still there. My grandma never went into too much detail. If you couldn't tell from this story, she never really did, but she did say this demon was malevolent and that it haunted her dreams. On her deathbed, she told me it was the only thing that scared her and that she hadn't made peace with, and that it was stalking her, getting closer and closer each day. Ultimately, this demon is what made her get cremated rather than buried. I never saw another full apparition of the demon, yet when visiting, I did see shadows disappearing around corners, and the house had a constantly depressing feel to it. My grandma had been in the business of occultism for nigh on 70 years, and even she struggled to cope with the power of a Ouija board. My advice? Don't go near them. Stay as far away from them as possible. It isn't a game. Growing up, I had always seen strange things. Things I later found out were shadow people in our house. When I was old enough, I read about them online, but my case had always been a little bit different. A lot of people would wake up to see them at the end of their bed, and although the same shadows could recur, there were often a plethora of different shapes, sizes, and varieties. My haunting was different. It was always the same jagged shadow. It was semi-human in shape, but didn't really have a definitive human form, and it was always lingering around my mum. Sometimes she'd be in the kitchen and it would be behind her. Sometimes it would be stood next to her chair. Other times it would actually float and follow her from room to room, and sometimes it just wouldn't be there at all. I had grown up seeing this, so never actually said anything about it. It was normal to me, though my mum admitted that she should have picked up on it due to the fact that some of my behaviour as a baby was abnormal. You know, looking at things that weren't there, reaching out into nothingness. However, after reading about shadow people and after realising it wasn't exactly normal, I asked my mum what this shadow was and why I was seeing it. She instantly began crying and apologised, saying she had no idea that I could sense it. I was confused, and she sat me down and told me how, when she was a little girl, she used a spirit board with her twin sister. It took a turn for the worse due to their inexperience and stupidity, and apparently things got so intense the board snapped itself and the planchette pinged away and they could never find it, even when they moved out. My mum told me that since then, since that night over 25 years ago, she had been stalked by a terrifying shadow. She described it as perfectly as I saw it and told me that she no longer took notice of it. It was a strange phenomena, yet it had never harmed my mother. I'm now 26 years old, and when I go to visit my mum, I still sometimes see this shadow, and although it seems harmless, I swear, each time I see it, it's getting closer and closer to her. Back in the early 90s, before me and my wife settled down and had a family, we would throw elaborate house parties for all of our friends. It was a weird situation. All of our friends and us basically lived on a secluded street in a small town on the southeast coast of England. Because of this, and despite 99% of us holding full-time jobs, there was a party at someone's house practically every single night. It was near Easter. I think it was 1992, but I'm not too sure, and we were hosting a party. Everyone turned up at about 7 PM in their hideous attire. You know, all the funky shapes and vibrant colours of the 90s. This night, things got pretty messy and it was 3 AM, which I later found out is the witching hour, when about 7 of us decided to use a Ouija board that I had found in the loft the day before. It wasn't mine, nor was it my wife's, so I assumed it must have belonged to the previous owners. None of us took the session seriously. If I'm honest, until after this, I had never believed in the paranormal. I thought it was a load of malarkey. So we were all super drunk and fucking about asking questions that I can't remember at all when the lights from the 2 lamps we had on began flickering and the main light, right above our heads, suddenly blew. We all squealed and a couple of the blokes cheered, but how did that happen? We kept playing with the help of the 2 lamps and the board repeatedly spelled out evil. Any other time, you would nope the heck out of there, but again, because we were all drunk, we didn't take it seriously and thought maybe one of us was messing around. Then, both the lamps blew. Us men, trying to act manly, pretended to be brave and reasoned it must have been a power surge. And I got 2 flashlights out of a drawer and shone it at the Ouija board. The planchette was spinning on its own. No one was even near it. We decided enough was enough, and I picked up the board and planchette and threw them into a cupboard before falling asleep on the couch. The next day, we could barely remember the Ouija board and could only really recall what I have previously written. Everyone had left by midday, and soon after is when really weird things began to happen. On more than one occasion, I would be sat watching TV only to feel as though I had just been covered in ice-cold water. I had calmed down to see a different show on TV. I had watched a full show without realising. A full 30 to 45 minutes, inexplicably gone. Other times her wife would be working. I'd be sat downstairs and would hear quick footsteps upstairs. There would be no one in but me. And at first I would investigate to see either nothing, nor to see clothes on hangers shaking violently. It got to the point that I'd be too scared to go upstairs and look. Separately, I would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to hear creaking from downstairs. I would go into our dining room to see our ceiling light shaking heavily. It wouldn't lose momentum unless I stopped it, except for on one occasion when it abruptly stopped itself, dead, in its tracks. I knew this was on that blasted Ouija board, and the hauntings intensified. My wife would wake in the night screaming bloody murder and would be covered in bruises and scratches. I would wake unable to breathe, a heavy weight crushing my chest, invisible and intangible. We had a home alarm that on one occasion began sounding, and I quickly went downstairs with a hammer to see our front door wide open. I called the police, who came quickly and searched the house top to bottom. They found no one. One of the weirdest things was when I went to check the cupboard a few months later to retrieve the Ouija board, and I pulled everything out of that fucking cupboard, but there was no trace of a Ouija board. And I asked my wife had she moved it, and she said no. I asked all my friends if they had, and they all said no. It had vanished, and still, to this day, I have no idea where it went. Parties at our house came to a halt as friends didn't want to visit anymore. One guest had claimed she had been locked in the bathroom for over 10 minutes and was screaming, something me, or none of the other guests, heard. Another guest claimed she had had her hair pulled, and still more guests claimed to see shadow people and vintage wooden toys that would disappear into the darkness of some rooms, moved by some unknown, invisible force. The last straw came one day about a year after it all started. Me and my wife were both awoke to the sound of a thunderous crash and bang. And I rushed downstairs to see a large cabinet that pretty much covered the whole back wall, face down, on the living room floor, having crushed our TV and coffee table. We both looked in shock when heavy leather-bound books began firing at us, with some serious force. I did have some pictures developed of the damage done to the spines of these books, but over the years, I have lost them. I'm not exaggerating when I say, if these books, thrown by some phantom ghoul, had hit one of us, it could have killed us. We set about moving house the very next day. We were a nice couple and came clean to all who came to view the house, and the couple that bought it from us seemed unfazed by the haunting. We moved one street over so as to stay close to work, friends and parties, and family. The couple that moved in became quite good friends and told us nothing strange ever happened to them. Oddly, nothing unexplained or spooky happened to us again, and all the activity stopped. I know it sounds a bit far-fetched and you've only got the word of an old gentleman on the internet to go off, but that's a true story of our haunting. Hi guys, Brothers Jackson here. Really hope you enjoyed that video. 5 True Scary Ouija Board Stories Volume 2. I thought there was a nice variety to those stories. Some of them more intense than others. Some of them just a one-off experience, others like a progression to a full-blown haunting. I really enjoyed reading them. I hope you enjoyed listening. However, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe for more. Comment any ideas that you have for future videos. Hit that bell notification and go follow me on Instagram. I post on Instagram all the time at the minute because it's just dead handy to use. So go drop a follow over there and you can see what I've been doing with my day if you even care or whatever. So thank you very much for watching this, and hopefully I've got a few collaborations coming out in January time. Thanks very much for watching. Peace out.